Hi everyone, this is Danelli. I recently did a talk for NALA and I wanted to go ahead and recreate that talk for YouTube, for my YouTube channel, because I thought it was pretty great. I really enjoy the topic, especially kind of the interdisciplinary approach that I take. I want to kind of pare it down to about 30 to 40 minutes for YouTube. And so I'm doing like one full length video, hoping that things will turn out um, relatively okay. I've had so many mishaps trying to film this video already that honestly, I'm going to give it a shot as if I was in front of a regular classroom. So if you see my notes, um, please bear with me. I am going to try my best to kind of keep it as concise as possible. Before I even get started, I want to talk a little bit about my methodology. I tend to work using an interdisciplinary approach. So, feminist psychoanalysis combined or fused with culturally relevant pedagogies, which is just another way of saying culturally relevant teaching strategies or teaching philosophies. I like to use a lot of culturally popular and relevant cases that are out in the public where the information is public for everyone to access. And I also tend to add a bit of a, trauma informed legal approach to my work. And I do this because I generally have a lot of interest in those three facets, and that tends to be the general trifecta or umbrella of my work. Overall, I'm also using the theme of consciousness, right? And where did I take that from? I actually borrowed that term from Gloria Anzaldua from her book Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, which was published in 1987. And this book has been around for a while already. It's been taught quite a lot at university, college level, bringing it to law and using it as a way of helping people reconnect to the ethics and the morals and the reasons why legal professionals are in the field in the first place was a great idea. Ansaldua's idea of consciousness is really a new consciousness, mestiza consciousness, una conciencia de mujer, in which she tries to meld two different cultures, two different languages, different sexual orientations as a way of fighting structural oppression. And is it still relevant today, even though, it was published in 87? Absolutely, more than ever, actually. Um, Something that I really want to highlight is that a lot of feminists are noting right now that we're experiencing a kind of whiplash from masculinity because of the progress that's been made with rights for women at a national and international level. There is kind of a whiplash that we're experiencing, and we're seeing this in gender relations between men and women. So, more than ever, this is extremely pertinent to very key specific areas of law, like family law, criminal law, civil law. And many times they kind of interact with each other or intersect with each other. Hence why I think also my approach is very relevant. Now, a lot of scholars have called violence against women an institutional phenomenon. It is at a structural level, embedded within society, within civil structures, everywhere. And I do want to highlight a few key statistics to keep in mind. Number one, the original statistics that a lot of researchers were working with was 3 out of 5 women experience some kind of abuse. And since about 2000, 2020, 2014, 2010 to 2014, we're working with 1 out of 3 women will experience some kind of domestic violence, interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence. So that is a lot of women. 1/3 of women will experience it at some point in their life. And for many of them, they're going to experience it again at a rate of about 60%. So the recidivism rate is roughly 60 to 90% for re-victimization and experiencing it again with a different partner once they've already experienced it with one partner. Let's talk a little bit about the perpetrators, the demographic of individuals that usually are carrying out abuse against women or violence against women. A lot of these situations don't get reported because they're considered mutual altercations by law enforcement, and that is one way in which like structure really negatively affects justice being carried out in these situations. And this is the case even when there is a gender difference. Many times it'll just be like a mutual altercation at home and that is it. However, many times when there are like gender differences, there are key things to note that are, useful facts for women to keep in mind about how it is that this phenomenon works to keep women trapped and repeating these cycles at the rate of about 60%. So one key thing to know about perpetrators is that there tends to be a huge differential in wealth, influence, and power between the perpetrators and the abuse victims. So that tends to facilitate a structure that holds the victim in place for a very long period of time. And many times victims will try to accumulate some kind of resources in order to leave because they tend to be cut out of resources by the time they do want to leave. Another key thing to know about the perpetrators is that more often than not, they will have some kind of dark psychology or a psychical fingerprint that will inevitably give them away. So you do have quite a few red flags that you can look out for, and essentially those are economic abuse, coercive threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, triangulation, male privilege, minimizing, denying, and blaming. Many of these work together. They don't always necessarily work in isolation. Oftentimes individuals have a very hard time spotting these red flags because they are blurred into one another like a net. Okay, so why do perpetrators use these manipulation tactics? A lot of it has to do with the psychology that I just mentioned, the dark psychology that many others are highlighting in social media. So there is something to the psychopathy, right? The individuals tend to have a deep sense of powerlessness and in some circumstances like extreme forms of narcissism. So you will actually notice that they will have a pattern and the pattern will reveal itself over time. And the more aware you are of these different types of red flags, the easier it is to spot. And the more you're aware of how they kind of interact with each other, the more likely that you'll be able to spot the red flags sooner, and that'll facilitate an exit for anyone that is experiencing any kind of interpersonal abuse. I want to talk a little bit about the victim's experience, right? In order to avoid re-victimization, it's so important to spot key strategies that'll help victims go from victim to survivor. So many times there's going to be a very specific way in which perpetrators will defend themselves, and also the way that attorneys will tend to defend perpetrators. And you see this in, media cases, big public cases all the time. There's a lot of victim blaming, survivor blaming. There is a lot of tarnishing of reputation. So really, like, any statements, actions, comments the individual ever made is going to be weaponized against that survivor in order to discredit the survivor. A lot of stereotypes will be weaponized, like the Madonna whore stereotype that Gilbert and Gabar talked about in The Mad Woman in the Attic. And there will be weaponization of patriarch glorification, which is essentially another way of saying like male privilege in society. This is particularly true in certain cultures. Things to look out for that are very, very important and usually will have very important key legal repercussions for survivors, which is like counter lawsuits, defamation lawsuits, or retaliation attempts of any kind. Typically, if you spot that a perpetrator is weaponizing the legal structure against a victim, there are ways in which attorneys for plaintiffs, for survivors, can make a court aware that this is in fact happening, and often it will be reviewed and the perpetrator may suffer consequences for that, because that is one key way in which you can spot an abuser that is weaponizing the system against survivors or victims. Many times they will try to reframe what they did by claiming that they had like a temporary moral weakness. So they'll generally say things like, you know, I did a bad thing, but I am not a bad person. I am not a bad individual. And they will use any social microaggressions or micro insults that they experienced themselves from any other protected category. They will weaponize that and frame themselves as the victim in order to say or justify, you know, I temporarily had bad judgment. And that is the summary of what actually happened. But it doesn't really stop there, right? We really need to start deconstructing how this happens in certain cases. And research is really focused around the area of victim blaming because it is so key. And generally, when a perpetrator is not done with their victim, they will weaponize whatever structure possible, including the legal structure, to gain an upper hand and continue abusing a victim. Much of this abuse is covert. It's not in your face, it's passive aggressive. So you really have to spot key ways in which it manifests itself. Another way in which like victim blaming is weaponized against survivors is with the question, well, why did it take them so long to say something? Why did they stay like with the victim or around, sorry, with the perpetrator or around the perpetrator for such a long time? And the questions alone are already victim blaming in action. So that is something to really keep in mind, that as soon as you hear those things from individuals, it's a lost cause. You already know that the structure, the abusive structure, has already gotten to that person. And it's going to be very difficult to re educate those individuals unless we open up the conversations, because that means that they've really lived their entire life with those paradigms deeply ingrained inside of them. Believe it or not, many victims don't even know that what they experienced was actually abuse. Many times there is no law or no name or just a real description for what their experience was. They only actually felt abused and lived with that feeling, oftentimes accompanied by physical symptoms, but probably didn't have language for it. Key example, California named and described and gave a punishment for stealthing, which is the removal of condoms during sex. And it is one of the only states in the United States to actually have done that. But labeling it allowed so many women, so many individuals to actually be able to have a word to describe their experience. Now, something else that prevents, you know, individuals from coming forward sooner is the fact that there's little to no evidence of what occurred. They are often the sole witness, and it's my word against his word for, you know, what happened. And it isn't usually until there are other victims that come forward or new evidence that's discovered that allows them to move forward with criminal or civil proceedings. And typically they're able to do that through the delayed discovery rule. So that is the structure that prevents victims from moving forward sooner. Psychoeducation really has a lot of potential here to change outcomes radically for women that have experienced abuse and that have experienced it at a structural level. Women who have daughters that were around when they experienced any kind of domestic intimate partner violence are more likely to experience it in their life. So, psychoeducation at a very early age has a lot to do with preventing the repetition of those cycles. Women that experienced it during their life, even though their mothers didn't experience it, are more likely to re experience it with other partners if they did not receive appropriate structural support or psychoeducation. Key things to know that are incredibly, at the top of the manipulation tactics for abusers are gaslighting, cognitive dissonance, and those do tend to have physical symptoms. So they're not just like mental health issues. You can experience instability, anxiety, foggy, thinking, foggy vision. Gaslighting is when an individual makes you question your reality, and essentially cognitive dissonance paired with gaslighting is a way of making you destabilized so that you're easier to manipulate and control. Cognitive dissonance is really like consistently putting two conflicting ideas together. And while some ambiguity is actually healthy for an individual to experience in their life, it can get to toxic levels and it becomes incredibly destabilizing for individuals. These manipulation tactics are super important to spot and to be able to immediately note that someone is attempting to use them against you. Something super key to a dynamic like this that helps extract a victim from the perpetrator is regaining self control, working on self control, working on reactivity, lowering reactivity levels. Because the more you react to a perpetrator's abuse, the more power and control they take from you because they know what works and what doesn't work. So, low reactivity, progressive distancing helps a lot. Low reactivity is super key here. I can't emphasize that enough because when you react, it is so easy for a perpetrator to frame the victim as an aggressor, and that is already giving away too much power. Keep in mind that much of an abuser's tactics will also fall into the area of negligence, which we all have heard of, like criminal negligence. And what is that, right? So, criminal negligence is when somebody has proven, either in their professional life or other areas in their personal life, that they can do something, that they have the IQ level and the skill to do something. But when it comes to the person they've chosen as their victim, they somehow suddenly lose those skills and that knowledge to complete a task to an appropriate level. And this negligence, you see it a lot in family court when parents decide that they don't want to actually be cooperative. And a more common way that individuals have framed this is weaponized incompetence. So we see that quite a lot. And believe it or not, there are ways in which an attorney can help a victim that is undergoing something like this. The more modern research is also centering itself around like the scope and the effect of abuse against women and how deeply embedded those structures are. Let me tell you, it's wide. Like I said, the key number here is 60%. So that number is super, super high. 60% and one third of women at some point in their life will experience it. I want to jump into a little bit of paralegal talk. I don't want to make this video like super, super long because, I do want to keep it kind of succinct. It's super key to keep in mind that sometimes jurisdiction really does matter, meaning where you file your case and how you file your case is super key. So in other words, basically if you file in one state using a certain set of laws, you have to follow the state laws. However, if your state doesn't have a certain law that would protect you directly, you could reference the laws in another state as an authority, for example. You also have to keep in mind if certain criminal acts were conducted from state to state. So that would take a case from a state level to potentially federal or international level. Look up the criminal code and look up the definition, because oftentimes, depending on the key details of the case or what happened, it might actually fit one thing better than another, and the maximum sentencing for a perpetrator has a lot to do with what code is applied. So that is super key. Now, one thing that I've heard as a paralegal that really fascinated me recently from an attorney was, how can 11 people, a group of reasonably smart and diverse mixed races, get it so wrong? How can 11 people, a group of reasonably smart and diverse mixed races, get it so wrong? This is a little bit controversial to say, but the average IQ is 97. The majority of the time when attorneys lose a case that to them seems like a clear-cut win, it's because they underestimated the ability of the jury to match the instructions with the evidence. Not only that, but they overestimated the psychoeducational levels of the jury. Times they underestimated the evolution of cultural thought. That is super key. The evolution of cultural thought. Believe it or not, even within BIPOC communities, there's still a huge, huge conservative trend, huge traditionalist trend. Just because they are diverse, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're thinking from a more modern perspective, or that they really actually understand how their decision is gonna structurally affect the victim in a case or many other women, including the women in their communities. As a writer, as a professor, something I want to really highlight for legal professionals, especially paralegals that are working with attorneys that are going to court, they need to close their rhetorical loops. I would tell any student of mine that was trying to figure out how to write a persuasive essay the same thing. Close your rhetorical loops. Do it every single day. Do a summary every single day. Close the rhetorical loops. Tell the jury what to think. Like, you need to connect the dots very clearly. Do not expect them to do it. We're working with the 97 IQ level people here, okay? You got to build on each day. You got to build up on the momentum to persuade the jury. Don't give them like time to think about it on their own. Lead them right to it. Realize that the work is going to be a lot of myth and stereotype busting. You're going to be a myth buster to some degree and stereotype buster. It is part of the legal field. There's going to be a lot of like educating your clients about things. They might not necessarily understand how their experiences are illegal or criminal or how they are protected through civil law. So that is super important when it comes to the topic of conciencia. That is conciencia, to be aware of how little or how much your clients might not know and their emotional experience. I'm not saying get, muddy with the emotional experience, but be aware that it is incredibly intense. Now, a couple areas where this is still like muddy waters when it comes to corporate law and sort of like data privacy, super controversial when it comes to key cases, including the one with like Uber sexual assault cases. And again, cannot emphasize enough the importance of psychoeducation. Sometimes court appointed therapy is necessary, and it could be suggested as, part of proceedings. Something else to keep in mind that very few people talk about in this sort of umbrella topic is more of the physical, like repercussions of being a victim or a survivor of trauma for a very long time, having to live with this kind of psychological harm, but also physical harm. Believe it or not, individuals who purely experience manipulation, psychical triangulations, cognitive dissonance, gaslighting can end up with very real physical symptoms. Anxiety that has physical symptoms, depression that leaves them bedridden. So it isn't just in their head. There are physical symptoms attached to this. And in fact, their neurocognitive abilities can decrease over time, their neuroplasticity. Women that experience a lot of physical violence can end up with CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Mouthful, that one. This entire like phenomenon can create brain trauma, brain fog, brain fog, freezing, no fight, no flight, fawning. So all of these are all traumatic responses and the result of some kind of traumatic background. Now I'm going to get to one of the more messier parts of the entire umbrella of this kind of violence against women. One of the key things I want to talk about is infant care and how oftentimes perpetrators might be or start like victims in their infancy, and they never received appropriate care or appropriate psychoeducation or psychotherapy, psychology's, psychiatry assistance. So that is something to keep in mind. Many times, abuse towards infant females can be explained away through alternate cultural paradigms. In other words, religious thoughts or ideas about female sexuality may end up being used as a way to justify the abuse of infant females or females that have not really been educated or are not old enough to understand that what they're experiencing is in fact abuse. Something else that is part of this umbrella of abuse is incest. It is criminal. A lot of states do actually have a criminal code for it, and generally it might require some nuanced investigation to figure out if it was intentional. Something else that needs to be debunked is fiesta culture and the role of alcohol in all of this. Many times we want to, look at fiesta culture as one of the more positive aspects of certain BIPOC cultures. Unfortunately, alcohol is often used within this culture to facilitate abuse and to lower inhibitions, to blur the lines of consent, make it easier to victim blame, because it creates ambiguous situations in which, individuals can state, well, the victim was drinking a lot and she seemed like she was enjoying herself. What we do notice with a lot of these Hollywood cases that have a lot of these different like data markers on abuse is that on top of all of this, the infamous NDA always makes an appearance. And a lot of victims or witnesses believe that because they've signed NDAs that they can't talk about what they know. It doesn't necessarily cover crime. And they're very often used in music, the corporate world, like I said, film and media. Those are industries in which the NDA is super popular to try to control any kind of bad press or drama around these types of cases. Mediation agreements are also very, very similar to NDAs. Just because you signed a mandatory mediation agreement with an employer, for example, it doesn't mean that you can't talk or file a uh, criminal report against someone that sexually harassed you at the workplace or something else, right? Mandatory mediation agreements are not the law and you can have them thrown out. A good attorney will know how to do that. Another topic of taboo, BDSM. Okay, so it's super, super taboo. A lot of individuals that are part of the community are very low key. They do not want that information public. And it's also very misunderstood. They tend to operate from a safe, sane, and consensual kind of methodology. However, it's still very unclear both in the culture and outside the culture how the law actually operates. A lot of professionals, such as myself, believe that a verbal contract works just fine. But when in doubt, put it in writing. That is super key. When in super doubt, notify your attorneys, notify any other representatives like a notary, etc. But have it in writing because that will help make sure to like we can establish as legal professionals whether there was any negligence at all. And believe it or not, there's been quite a few cases in the media about this, and they have been incredibly sensationalized by journalists. Final pieces of advice, right? As an instructor, professor, and paralegal, I always recommend journaling to literally everybody because believe it or not, sometimes when you're in the midst of these cases, it's so easy to lose track of the information, details, facts, sometimes even the paperwork. So journaling is a great way of keeping everything together, keeping a chronology of everything, and also tracking any like mental health issues with corresponding physical symptoms because when you are being abused, sometimes that evidence is key. So, journal, my advice, and don't forget, conciencia means having a moral conscience and being aware of essentially the way that these cases of abuse deeply impact not just the individual clients, but all of society and all of women, and believe it or not, also men. Final PSA, be careful of any public statements you make regarding key individuals that are super public. Just be careful because you can be slapped with a cease and desist letter, and that's not great. I've seen this happen to a couple of social media figures lately and journalists that have talked about issues between famous couples, and it's gotten messy. If the case is not resolved yet and the information and facts have not been released, be careful what statements you make. Look for signs of burnout. That's also part of conciencia. Remember, these cases are super tough. They're tough to handle. They're tough to see every day and hear about every day. So, moral consciousness and consciousness overall is about being self aware about yourself and how your body is taking all of this because vicarious trauma is a thing, okay? Last but not least, I want to give you key cases that I use in my work. The Sean Combs case, in other words, P. Diddy's case, which happened very recently, Harvey Weinstein's case. Gloria is also in the news with several cases actually, the Uber Tech case about sexual assault, and Michaela Rylard's dam, which is the dominatrix that accidentally killed her client. Those are all great resources for anybody that's looking for examples about what I'm talking about and why these key cases tend to influence what we think about the subject of violence against women overall, not just at a national level, but international level. So take those with you, and I hope that you really liked this video. Please like, subscribe, follow, all that great stuff. I would really appreciate it. It took me forever to get this video done. So I hope that you liked it. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will follow up with them, I promise. Thank you. Bye.